Hello, everyone. I am Claudiu Murgan, the host of the Spiritual Inspired podcast, and my guest today is Dawson Church. Dawson is an integrative healthcare researcher and an award-winning author whose best-selling book, The Genie in Your Genes, has been hailed by reviewers as a breakthrough in our understanding of the link between emotions and genetics. Dawson is the founder of the EFT Universe, Emotional Freedom Techniques, whose mission is to bring the healing benefits of EFT tapping and meditation to the greatest number of people consistent with high standards of ethics and integrity. More information about his activity and programs you can find at EFTUniverse.com. Dawson, thank you very much for joining me today.
Claudiu, great pleasure to be here.
I know you have a large following and you wrote amazing books. And I'd like to start the discussion with two words I consider magical. And I know you have a deep understanding of the concept behind them: spiritual intelligence. More and more, this concept moves to the mainstream. Why?
Because people know there is something more than just the material world around us. And it's really obvious that if we are only focused on the material parts of our existence, our body, mind, our heart, the things we can touch, taste, see, use with our five senses, that we're missing the biggest part of experience. We know that love, energy, intelligence, that wisdom, that kindness, that compassion, all of these things are what really make life worth living. So I think that's what people are looking for. And in our material societies, once we've got all the material things dialed in, you've got a roof over your head, you've got refrigeration, you've got all the transportation and all the basic needs met, where do you go next? And the answer is to expressing your full potential. And spiritual intelligence is what gets you there.
And it's interesting that you say that we have to take care of our basic needs first and then try to step into our soul's purpose. But still, a lot of us don't understand that in the end, this is the purpose of life, not how many cars or how many homes we have, but to fall into our purpose, be in connection with divinity and the God of our understanding. And it's quite hard still to make people realize that they have to do that.
Well, one useful frame for this is Abraham Maslow's famous pyramid of needs. And he defined that in the 1960s. It became one of the dominant paradigms in psychology and personal growth. And so he conceived it as a pyramid. At the bottom is survival. And you have to have survival needs met. Like, you can't really go to a higher plane of consciousness if you're struggling with things like, where do I get my next meal from? Or there are predators outside the door. So you have to get that safety and survival layer taken care of, and then social needs and various other things about that. But at the top, very top of the hierarchy, he put self-actualization. But in the last 2 years of Maslow's life, he began to realize and experience that there's a level far beyond self-actualization, and that's self-transcendence. And self-transcendence is when we get to the point where we see something greater than ourselves. In meditation, we do this. All the great saints, sages, St. Francis, Rumi, St. Teresa, St. Clare, Ramakrishna, East and West, they talk about entering these stages of bliss, ecstasy, samadhi, ananda, whatever you want to call it. And these are states of consciousness that far transcend the local level, the level of ordinary reality. And so that's moving to that level of being in touch with and in communion with something that is infinitely larger than yourself. That's consciousness, that's being, that's the all it is. And so when you live a life that's that springs from that, when you give at least some of your attention, like a famous Hindu scripture is called the crest jewel of illumination. And it's instructions for enlightenment. It's this most remarkable document composed like 2,000 years ago by a Hindu sage called Shankara. And he says that there is the real, and the real is that which endures. The real is that which is always there. And then there's the unreal, that which is changing and coming and going and passing and shifting. And he says, if all you do is live your life in the unreal, if all you do is live your life focused on things that are going to disappear in a year, in 5 years, in 50 years, in 100 years, and you give no thought to the real, the transcendent, then you've really wasted your life. And so I think that there's a real focus in people's lives at this point on, once we met those survival needs, of then moving into those states of transcendence and joy and bliss, and that then has an opportunity to move through into your regular life. And spiritual intelligence is what gives you that ability to move those elevated states into ordinary life.
Yes, and the states you just mentioned, the elevated states and the higher state of consciousness, is the ideal way of living. And while I'm also optimistic, I also see a lot of people getting very complacent with their daily lives. And even if they have a very good living standard of living, especially in the Western societies, they still lack the focus on themselves to go inside. And there is this, trauma that eats them alive, and they don't want to address it. That's the issue I see.
Well, if you think about the way our brains are structured, and this is the product of millions of years of evolution, our brains are hardwired. The actual structure of our brains, we're not talking about the way you use your brain, we're talking about the anatomy of your brain here. And so through our senses, we gather information about the outside world. That's transmitted up through the spinal column into the thalamus, into the limbic system. It then is distributed throughout the brain for processing. But our brains evolved in an environment of threats. And 100,000 years ago, 500,000 years ago, there were all these threats to our survival. And they were very real, daily, literal threats. There were animals, there were other roving bands of humanoids who, and over the process of evolution, I mean, Neanderthals were alive 20,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago, and there were Denisovans, various other bands competing with Homo sapiens. So we had to learn to survive in a really hostile environment. And so we have all this brain anatomy geared to detecting and responding to threats. And while we have all of this hard wiring in our brain to find and focus on what's wrong, that there's that tiger in the grass, there's that poison ivy, that poison oak, there's that snake that might strike. So our brains are hardwired to scan the horizon every second of every day. Even while we're asleep, a significant part of our attention is focused on what's going on around us. Is it safe? And now that there are no snakes, there are no tigers, what do? That equipment, that anatomic equipment in our brain is still scanning the horizon, looking for what's wrong. And now all I can find, Claudiu, is I got a pimple. I got a presentation to make my boss next week. I got a button that's fallen off my shirt. We start to pay attention to all of these worries about our lives and about our health and about things that really are not life-threatening. And by doing so, we short-circuit our joy. And the brain has two main structures that are active here. We have the default mode network, and that's a set of regions in the center line of the brain. And that's the basic part of the brain that focuses on what's wrong. It ruminates, it reflects on bad things that happened yesterday and bad things that might happen tomorrow, which again is perfect. If you had a near brush with death with a rattlesnake yesterday and might have another rattlesnake strike you tomorrow. But, we live in an environment in which there are very few rattlesnakes, very few other things going wrong. So our default mode networks are active. In fact, our brain defaults to using that part of the brain. Then there is another part of the brain, the TOS positive network, our lateral part of the brain. And that is, if we use it effectively, can lead to creativity, to joy, to resilience, to gratitude. And what we find in people who meditate, who use energy therapies, who spend time in nature, who are kind and compassionate, is they literally shift activity away from the default mode network into that lateral network and are much, much happier than those that follow the evolutionary programming of worry. So it's really a choice, and we can choose which of those two focuses we have. In any moment, we have all these tools that allow us to process stress now. 50, 100 years ago, we didn't have EMDR, we didn't have EFT tapping, we didn't have all of the wonderful somatic therapies we have today. We've got these therapies now, and research shows that they can very, very quickly release PTSD, anxiety, depression. There are literally thousands of studies showing that somatic therapies very quickly release all these forms of stress. When we release that stress, when we meditate, then we can enter these elevated states of awareness. And when we do that, we find levels. In my book, Bliss Brain, I talk about anandamide, the bliss molecule. It has the same structure as THC, which is the active molecule in marijuana. But when you use meditation to produce anandamide in your brain, suddenly you have this ecstatic neurochemical flooding your brain, and you feel absolutely wonderful. You feel stoned.
Yes.
And that's the place to go.
Indeed, it's such an interesting field, and I'd like to know, how did you decide, or what determined you to create these techniques and go into this interesting field?
Misery. Being miserable, being unhappy. I remember my high school, and there was one boy, Claudiu, that was happy. I remember one boy in my high school who was just genuinely happy. The rest of us were so miserable, we varied only in the degree of misery. And there's a famous quote from Henry David Thoreau. He says, "Most people live lives of quiet desperation." And in my family, that wasn't true. Most people lived lives of loud desperation. They were loudly desperate. They were telling everyone their troubles, you know. And so I grew up among people who weren't particularly happy, and very few people I knew were really happy. And the world wasn't a very happy place. And so I thought, I know some people are happy. You know, I see St. Francis. I look at images of Rumi. I look at some of these great saints and sages, Ramakrishna, Ramana Maharshi. And these people really had this source of these inner springs of joy. What are they doing? And of course, they're meditating. They're in touch with something beyond themselves. So when I was 15 years old, I went to go live on a spiritual community, and I spent time meditating, studying the world's perennial philosophy, the great principles that underlie the world's religions, and reading Alan Watts and Ram Dass and Aldous Huxley and all these great teachers, and getting a little bit happier, learning psychology in my 20s. And then when I began to really get serious about meditation in my 40s, that's when things started to shift. I made the commitment to meditating every single day. And then I began to look at what science tells us about effective meditation. And I discovered that most of the stuff I was doing in meditation was not very effective. So I worked with other researchers. We developed a method called eco-meditation that was really effective. It just combines the best of simple science-based techniques to help you meditate quickly, fast. We also helped with the development of a stable form of EFT tapping on acupuncture points. What that does is that releases stress really quickly. We now estimate that about 40 million people all over the world are using EFT. Of course, hundreds of millions are meditating. And we see people rapidly dropping trauma and stress. The reduction in PTSD in people doing this is about 65%. People have about a 65% drop in symptoms like flashbacks, nightmares, intrusive thoughts when they do EFT. When they meditate, it can also really reset their whole nervous system. So that's why we say we have these tools now. We didn't have a generation ago. One of my friends was saying, Dawson, now we have EFT, we have meditation, we know how to fix ourselves. He was saying, my parents, they just suffered. That's all I knew how to do. But in the course of me extricating myself and becoming a person so happy, I wake up in the morning, I just jump out of bed, thrilled to meditate, go to meditation, end meditation, feel wonderful, do some EFT, feel even better, go to work. I have problems to deal with at work, but I just stay centered. And it really, really makes a difference in not just your own personal life. You find your whole life, your whole career becomes service, and then your main focus is expressing and living love. Just, I mean, you know, once you tap into the universe up there in meditation, you know we live in a conscious universe. The universe is conscious, and the universe is full of joy and grace and gratitude and love and awe. And you just sit there in meditation, and you are shaken to your core by the power of the love of the universe pouring through. You then go to work and start to manifest that in your work as well, and you have a pretty wonderful life.
Yes, thank you. So many things to unpack, and I will go back to the fact that you mentioned the word love several times. And I had an interview recently with Susan Taylor, who is a holistic healer, and I asked her, "What do you think humanity needs right now?" And she said, "Love is the main thing we need in order to heal." So I'm glad that you also are on the same wavelength.
Absolutely. And we do want love, and we tend to look for it outside of ourselves. We we in fact find love when we tap into the universe, and we find the universe is love. The fabric of the universe is love. When I was 15 years old and went into that spiritual community, I was laying in on my bed one day, and just in the depths of despair. At that time, I was suicidal. I wanted to kill myself. I didn't want to be here at all. I was just this miserable teenager. And I had this vision suddenly, just spontaneously, of the cosmos. I was out there drifting in the void. I was drifting out there in infinity. And I realized the universe was full of love. The stuff of the universe was consciousness and love. Now I came back to Earth, and that vision lasted only a short while, but I knew then that was possible. And I spent many decades trying to get my way back to it. And then when I did, I then focused on science. How do we validate this through clinical trials? How do we bring people to those states? How do we find methods that'll help us unlock that human potential? And that's been the big shift we have now. Is we have MRIs, we have EEGs, we have gene tests. I've done a lot of genetic work where we actually measure people's levels of gene expression before and after these experiences. And I can tell you, your genetic profile changes. You can have, you have all these genes for heart disease and Alzheimer's and cancer, but if they are dormant, if they are silenced, then those diseases never make themselves manifest. That's what happens with people who are positive, who are aware of that reality of love, and it affects you down to the level of your gene expression. So I love sharing this and seeing people make these discoveries. That good feeling of feeling good in your body you get from meditation and all these other techniques, that means your genes are changing, and we're literally expressing genes that keep us healthy, and we're silencing genes that are associated with those diseases like Alzheimer's, cancer, and heart disease. We're literally making changes in our body with our consciousness, and then over time, those produce radically different outcomes in our lives. Optimists live, on average, 10 years longer than pessimists, according to long-term studies. So that decision you make today and tomorrow and the next day, little choices you're making many times a day to shift into optimism, to love, to joy, to kindness. You're choosing to be compassionate rather than be angry. Make that choice over and over again, many times a day, many times a week, many times a month. You're changing your longevity. You're changing your long-term gene expression, and your whole life will be different as a result.
Yes, and we'll go back to this discussion of about reprogramming our genes. But I want to touch on what you said when you were 15 years old and what you felt at that time. Because in my opinion, I think this feeling, the dreading feeling, the new generation had that in your when you were young, has not healed in any way and has been accentuated, I think, over years. And I'll give you a sad example. Only weeks ago, a friend of my younger son committed suicide. He was at university, and he just couldn't take it anymore. So imagine all these young fellows, 18 and 19, going to a funeral of their friend. And he might not be the only one going through this turmoil. and the parents didn't have any idea about what is going on, because they don't know how to express themselves. They don't know that there are tools out there. So the question to you is, how can you and people like you who are in this field and they are the experts can go and start this process at a younger age, because you are pretty much damaged goods when you reach 50, 60, and the process will be longer. But when you are in your teens, late teens, you're going to accept these techniques much easier potentially, and you have a long time or longer time to heal and really live your life in a much better way.
Yes. And I'm just thinking about my college roommate. He committed suicide a couple of years after college, and it also came out of the blue. I was shocked, and his parents were stunned. We had no idea he was suffering so much. And so there's research into a field called relational spirituality. And that means you don't just have a vague belief in something greater than yourself. It means you have a relationship with something greater than yourself. And so one thing we can do is make room in our society, in our families, for sharing and dialogue about elevated experiences. And Father Andrew Greeley is a Catholic priest, is also a novelist, is also a researcher, and he did the first studies of this in the 1970s. And he found that most people have what are called anomalous experiences. They have experiences of visions, they have experience of clairaudience, clairsentience, they have all kinds of altered states. Almost everyone has them. That was a big surprise of those early findings. And the other big surprise was that they didn't tell anybody about them. They did not tell their priest, their rabbi, their mother, their father, their wife, their friends. They didn't tell anyone about them, because who was I going to tell when I was 15 years old and having this experience? My minister? Don't
and
think
they're
so.
being considered possessed, to be honest.
Absolutely, I would have been thought of as being, a heretic. If I told the therapist, I mean, one of my friends did tell people around him when he began to see visions. He was about 50 years old, and he wound up in a locked ward in a psychiatric hospital, being given involuntary medication. So we've tended to regard spiritual emergence as a psychosis. And if you go to just the history of psychiatry, you'll find that spiritual emergence, having those visions, dreams, experiences, connections with something greater than yourself, is thought of as being a deviant mental illness.
Yes.
So we got to medicate you. We got to give you drugs to take away all that stuff. So, I mean, and if you think about the Catholic Church, they put those people in front of the Inquisition, and they burned a bunch of them at the stake. So there's not been a lot of place in our society to go put these experiences. And so that's the first thing we have to do is we like, I encourage my grandchildren to talk about their spiritual experiences. They may have them, they may be able to articulate them, they may not, but at least they have somebody they can sit with, and then they can have a forum for them. So legitimizing these experiences, knowing about spiritual emergence and about spiritual emergency. So there are relational spirituality studies, and they show a dichotomy. And in the words of one famous researcher, depression and spirituality are two sides of the same coin, and they involve the same brain structures. And what happens is, if we do not develop spiritually, we tend to become depressed. And if we are depressed, we tend to neglect our spirituality. And even people who are spiritual and then have a life crisis, and they may have a loss, they may get sick, they may lose a loved one, they may lose money or a house or a job or something else they treasure. We find that there's this phenomenon in my book, Bliss Brain. I have a whole chapter on this phenomenon called post-traumatic growth. Spiritual people actually, when they hit a wall, when they hit that life crisis, they actually tend to rebound to a higher level of self-transcendence. So they literally use adversity as the fuel for self-transformation. This is very poorly understood in psychiatry and psychology and in society. So we want to make sure people have a way they can go to other people and talk about, oh, you saw an angel. Like I had a child who died. One of my children, I have three children. My three living children, my second child died. And I remember the day being at the hospital and my wife holding the body of this dead baby. I mean, it is just something I hope no one ever has to experience. And it's just one of those moments when your life feels like it's crumbling. In fact, most marriages, about half of all marriages where a child dies like that, the whole marriage falls apart in the next 2 years. It's so shattering to people psychologically. As I was there in the hospital with my wife and this dead baby, I sensed four huge blue shining beings around the bed. Now, who they were or why they were blue or what their names were, don't ask me that. But I just remember that they were almost like this, like putting a capsule of love and meaning around this. I needed meaning back then. It's like, why did my son die? I couldn't understand this. Didn't seem fair, and yet I felt embraced again in that field of love. So when do you think I could go tell anybody that I knew about the 4, 15-foot high blue beings of light? I didn't tell anybody about that. I wrote a book about it a few years later, but we can't share these experiences. And the data shows almost everybody is having them. We don't have a way of sharing them. But like my wife and I, now it's wonderful when you do. Like we will share our dreams when we wake up in the morning. We'll share our spiritual visions. We have a place we can bring our elevated experiences to each other. And it's powerful when you do have a community. I have friends I can call up. I have researcher friends. I got to tell you, a lot of scientists are into this. A lot of researchers are researching people having transcendent experiences, and they're finding remarkable changes in their brains. Their brains start changing within a few days of a transformational experience in a really positive, healthy way. So now there's a place in this for science. We have studies of relational spirituality. We have studies of transcendence. We have studies of altered states. And we're showing that these people become remarkably happy and become even more functional at their work in their families than they were before. So it's a very different society we're moving into, where there will be space for this. And the research is showing this is the most important thing you can do in your growth, in your personal development as a human being, is validate and then give time for these experiences, and certainly for daily meditation in your life.
Yes, and I think society will become more acceptable or acceptable of these states of awareness and consciousness and feelings we go through, if they will understand the fact that we are not, we are spiritual beings locked in a human body and not the other way around.
Yes.
That, I think, is the misconception, and that's why all the fear and the trauma and everything that comes with it.
Absolutely. That phrase was written by a Catholic priest called Teilhard de Chardin in the 1950s. We are not human beings on a spiritual path. We are spiritual beings on a human path. And when you perceive yourself, one of the most long-running studies, actually probably the longest running study of human development, is the Harvard Adult Development Study. Began in 1938, and it's been studying people for 80 years now, how they develop as adults. And one of the former directors of that study said that the most important thing we can do is shift from being enmeshed in our experience to perceiving our experience from above, having a perspective on our lives. And neuroscience is called perspective taking. You have parts of your brain that become active when you are taking perspective. If you're seeing your life, then you're able to perceive your life. If you're enmeshed in your life, thinking that your physical life is all that is, you're just this little human being, and then maybe you're once in a while going to church or synagogue or the mosque and having an experience, That's not it. It's the shift to perceiving yourself from that transcendent perspective, and then looking down on, oh, I have a mind. Seeing your mind as something you have, not something you are. Seeing your body as something you have, not something you are. The great Indian sage Ramana Maharshi, when he was dying, he was 70 years old. He was dying, and he spent most of his life in this one part of India, and they said, Master Bhagavan, are you in pain? And Ramana Maharshi said, my body is in pain. I am not in pain. No. So that's the making that shift where you perceive that I have a body. It's not who I am. I have a mind. I have emotions, but they are not me, who I am. And Ramana Maharshi said, ask who you are. Ask, who am I? And who you are is this glorious being of consciousness that is living in this human life. You're stumbling. You're making mistakes. It's imperfect. Things don't go well. Eventually your body wears out. You die. So that's part of being human. And if you're living it from that transcendent perspective, it's a glorious adventure.
Yes, and also the Indian sages tell us that this is how God experienced a human behavior through us, and we have to be open and accept this type of mentality and thinking, and life would be much easier. And if we learn from every single challenge we have, then yes, we can move forward smiling and not having a grudge.
Well, you don't mourn your losses, and you don't get exhilarated about your supposed triumphs in the outer world, and so you have some sort of big thing that seems very positive happen in the outside world, and you're just content. You're so grateful for that thing happening, and then you have a big loss, like in one of the California wildfires in 2017. It was the middle of the night, and my wife shook me awake at 12:45 a.m. and said, Dawson, something's wrong. And I jumped out of bed, looked out the window, and there was a wildfire racing through our valley toward our house. And we literally grabbed our car keys, threw on clothes, and ran for the car and drove out through the flames. And I tell that story in my book, Bliss Brain, in the first chapter of Bliss Brain. I tell the story of the fire. And so we were just wiped out. We lost in minutes. We lost our entire home, every single possession we had, except for our car and the clothes we had. We didn't have a change of clothes. We didn't have anything to our names back after that. We lost our office. Our office burned up. Everything we had, we lost. All our mementos, all our pets, all our photographs, everything material. Suddenly, it was stripped away, and it was hard. It was difficult. I mean, we had to go through a period of recovery and therapy and using all of these techniques on ourselves. But we meditated, and we used EFT tapping. We used all kinds of other therapies to help us recover. And it's not like we were happy about all this. I mean, we would rather not have gone through that tragedy. And I mean, many of our neighbors died, and 5,000 homes were destroyed, and 5,000 families suddenly were homeless overnight. This wasn't a happy time, but you're resilient. Right now, we're working with psychologists in Ukraine, because I have a big nonprofit called the Veteran Stress Solution, and we work with people with PTSD, and we were training psychologists in Ukraine to work with traumatized people there. We've trained people who worked in Haiti after the earthquake there. We trained people who work in Rwanda with genocide orphans there. We have all of these projects to help people, and it's powerful when you start to then live this out in the outside world, release your stress. So I use those methods on myself after the fire, and within a year, I was realizing that I still had anandamide, this ecstatic chemical in my brain. I still felt wonderful every day. I'd lost everything, and I had not lost compassion, love, gratitude, joy, awe, well-being. I had all the things that mattered. Didn't count if I'd lost my house. I still had everything that mattered in terms of spiritual riches. So if you live your life that way, everything changes.
Yes, and I know it's hard for you and other families to go through something like this. It happened in Canada and other parts of the world. And if you stay positive, we can look at this as a cleansing and start fresh. And I know it happened to me once. These days, if you have a computer crash and everything is wiped out, it's kind of a disaster. It's calamity because everything you have, documents and information is there. So it happened to me in 2015. It's not at the same level of what happened to you, but I remember, and it happened while I was in Australia, working there for a week, and it happened there. I had nothing else, no internet, nothing. And I didn't panic. I just look at it. Okay, that's it. I'll get a new hard drive. Everything is wiped out. I'll start fresh. And going at that time, I didn't know about any technique. I didn't know about meditation. So it was 2005. So I now remembering that moment, I realized that I behaved as I should have behaved. Just let it go and learn from it. Yeah.
And you'll find that a lot of these great teachers, spiritual teachers. I mean, Rumi had a very turbulent life. His teacher was got in a lot of trouble. There's a lot of violence in his community. If you look at St. Francis, he had a difficult life. He was rejected by the church. When he went to Rome, it was a flip of a coin whether they would excommunicate him and burn him at the stake, or turn him into a living saint. I mean, it was not easy for him. Saint Teresa, read their lives. Julian of Norwich, I mean, they often had extremely tough lives. Mother Teresa, I mean, she lost her faith at times. Modern saints. Gandhi had enormous persecution. Martin Luther King. So you look at these people who are elevated, and you think their lives are easy. Think again. They went through hell very often, but we have the opportunity to shift ourselves. One of the things that newer data shows is that the world is really diverging in terms of whether people live in heaven or live in hell. And the number of people who live with the feeling their life is hell is actually increasing. There are increasing numbers of people, especially since COVID, who feel as though the world is on a downtrend, their own personal lives are on a downtrend, and they're just in misery. But at the same time, there are people who are thriving. And of course, science, when you read science, if you read the last chapter of my book, Bliss Brain, or my book on manifestation, Mind to Matter, I collect a lot of the science around how our world is actually thriving. There are all these things going right with our world, all these markers of human flourishing now. The average lifespan's doubled in the last century. The average person in the world is 3 times as wealthy as he or she was in just 1980. Just in 40 plus years, global wealth has tripled, especially in the poorer countries of the world. Infant mortality, maternal mortality, infant literacy, female literacy, all kinds of measures. The world has been improving for the last 60, 70 years since World War II. Sure, are there wars? There are wars, there are conflicts, there are bad things going on all the time. And yet the big picture is of a human species, which is getting more compassionate, getting kinder, getting wiser. And so the top 20% of people are in that heaven. They're thriving. They're meditating. The number of meditators in developed countries has increased 20-fold. For every one meditator we had in 1980, we have 20 now, today. Huge rise in the number of meditators who are having lives of well-being and who are feeling fantastic about themselves. So at the top end of the spectrum, more and more people are in heaven. At the bottom end of the spectrum, like in a recent Gallup poll looking at happiness, when people were asked to rate how good their lives were, 0 through 10, 21% of people in India said they were 0 out of 10. Their lives could not possibly get any worse. They were 0 out of 10. 21% of Indian adults said that. Almost the same percentage in Mexico and China. So there are parts of the world where people are not thriving, and there are parts of every country where people are just feeling as though they're in hell. And so it's such a puzzle. Here we are, we're all in the same world. We're all in exactly the same circumstances. Some people are thriving. Other people are scoring their lives at 0 out of 10. And you want to use those tools. We know meditation could radically shift you. We know EFT and some of the other energy therapies can reduce your trauma, reduce your pain, help you thrive. And so these things are there. It's just a matter of decreasing that activity in our default mode network, in our suffering networks, lighting up the joy, compassion, positive emotion parts of our brain, and then gradually our whole brain anatomy shifts in that direction. And then we fundamentally become positive, happy human beings, and that's ours for the rest of our lives.
Yes, and as you mentioned, it all depends on our mindset and how we see life, because we create our own hell or heaven. And in your book, Mind to Matter, you just mentioned, you describe 7 practices for generating the brain wave frequencies that could potentially activate anti-aging hormones and manifest matter. Can we expand on that, please?
Yeah, so knowing the science is great. So Mind to Matter is all about how our brain activity and mental activity creates the world around us. And our minds and our brains are creating molecules all the time. If you think a stressful thought, one stressful thought accompanied by strong emotion, and you tell your body to make cortisol and adrenaline, you are making molecules, you're creating molecules purely by that stressful thought. That's also going to be decreasing some healthy molecules in your body because it's going to scavenge healthy molecules to build that cortisol and adrenaline. So we're shifting our molecules in our bodies by the quality of our thoughts. But we're also shifting things outside of us. We're drinking water, for example, and the water molecule is the H2O molecule is affected by the quality of consciousness of the person holding it. When you hold your water and you bless it, research shows there's actually a change in those H2O molecules. So here, we're affecting molecules inside our bodies, we're affecting molecules outside our bodies, and I recommend a whole series of practices in Mind to Matter that will help generate positive change inside and outside of us. Simple things, I mentioned meditation, I mentioned EFT, simple things like time in nature. Time in nature by itself produces positive gene expression. Grounding, taking off your shoes, standing on wet grass will help you ground. Positive somatic experiences will help you. Positive social experiences help you. I become more and more, I'll put it this way, Claudiu, I become less and less polite about recommending to people they get rid of negative people in their lives. And I just say out front, I used to be I used to tiptoe into the subject and make polite suggestions. Now I'm saying, get rid of negative people in your life. If there are people in your life that make you feel terrible or down or depressed, don't ever see them again. Now, of course, if it's your son or daughter, it's a little hard, or your parent or your relative, but certainly your friends. Surround yourself with positive people. In the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, Patanjali says self-study, one of the gifts of yoga, self-study, one of the gifts of being on this path, Patanjali says in this 2,000-year-old Vedanta text, he says, one of the benefits of this work is the company of bright beings. You find yourself in the company of bright beings. And we find that people who are full of love and compassion and kindness literally attract other people. A study was published this week showing that depressed people who are depressed, tend to congregate with other depressed people, and in fact are repelled by happy people. People who are miserable go find other miserable people to be miserable with, and they tend to avoid people who are happy. When people are happy, they tend to go find other happy people to be with. So as you ditch the people in your life who are miserable, depressed, overwhelmed, confused, have a lot of negative emotion, there's no reason why you should let them go. Maybe it's an old friend. Who cares? Find new friends. You know, the excuses you've been making to keep up your friendships with people who are toxic, you do not want those people in your life for one more second. Let them go. So that's one of those practices in my book, Mind to Matter, is find and cultivate positive social relationships.
Yes, and if we apply the quantum manifestation protocols, we can create our reality where these friends will slowly um, disappear and they don't come back ever. And it happened to us as well. And we find it very interesting, especially that we know how it's happening and why it's happening. And just observing this phenomenon is it's quite amazing. And you mentioned water. I studied water. I wrote 3 books on water, about water and the benefits and how it changes and how it changes us. And I think this is my contribution to the world, to bring awareness to how important water is in our lives.
Conscious water, just living consciously, being conscious of water. Water also, they say our bodies are 70% water. Actually, our bodies are 70% water, but 99% of the molecules in our bodies are water. Even the non-water substances in our bodies are largely made up of H2O. So having that conscious life where you're conscious of water, conscious of food, conscious of touch, conscious of how you look at other people, conscious of what's in your heart, the energy you're putting out. And after living a passionate life full of love for a while, that just gets to be the reality you live in. And then you find yourself attracting these people who are like that. And that's what puts you in that 20% who are in heaven. So it may take making changes, it may take saying no to certain people, certainly will take saying no to certain habits that hold you back. And as you do this, as you develop yourself, again, you are deciding whether you will be in that 20% living in hell or the 20% who are in these ecstatic states.
Yes, indeed. Dawson, I saw on your website that the EFT was accredited by medical associations as well. How have you been able to accomplish such a feat? I mean, it's just unbelievable.
Persistence. At first, I tried to get into the Veterans Administration in the U.S., and they just didn't want to hear about it. I even was able to contact members of the American Congress, and members of Congress wrote to the head of the Veterans Administration saying, hey, look, this research is showing veterans heal from PTSD. And the head of the VA said, no way, we're not allowing this in the door. So 20 years ago, it was very discouraging. We tried and tried and tried, but we just kept on building up more and more and more and more research until eventually they allowed it in as an official method. But there's still a lot of resistance. There's now a whole faction of the American Psychological Association trying to squash energy therapies, saying they're pseudoscience. We don't believe in acupuncture, acupressure, energy therapies. It's just imagination. They don't really work. But in countries like South Korea, EFT is now regarded as a frontline primary treatment. In other words, primary means that it's the first thing you get. You go into a doctor's office, you go into a dentist's office saying you're afraid of needles. The first thing they do with you is EFT. So it's gaining ground in the world. Every great breakthrough in science is usually met with skepticism and denial and opposition. And I forget what civil rights leader said. In civil rights, there was this famous saying that first they persecute you, they arrest you, they deny you, and they eventually you win. So we're at the winning stage now with energy therapies.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, this should be in school as well, as sessions with students who need this type of help. And if they at least are aware of the concept, they can take it separately, individually, to learn about it, buy the manual and try it with professionals or try it on their own. But at least they should be aware, because I know the teenagers have their own mindset, their own environment, and this is something that they are not aware and interested into at this point. But if you bring it forward, at least some of them might pay attention.
Yeah, and there are some school systems like Santa Barbara, California, Lima, Peru. There are quite a few school systems where EFT has caught on, and we've also used volunteers have used it in places where there have been school shootings, like Parkland, Florida, and Newtown, Connecticut. Uvalde, Texas. It's been used in the US where there have been these mass shootings, and a lot of those communities have received treatment with EFT. So it is gradually making its way into schools. And why it's important to get it to people early is because if people learn EFT at 65 or 85, that's just wonderful. If they can relieve their stress when they're 85 years old, but if they learn it when they're 12, before they hit puberty, and then all the social anxiety, all the test anxiety, everything they have to do, if they learn to meditate and tap and do all these things to relieve their stress, their lives are just dramatically better than they otherwise would be. Think again about those studies showing that suicide and spirituality are engaged the same parts of the brain. They're two sides of the same coin, and that our mental health improves dramatically in tune with our spirituality.
Yes, and another famous example, and 100-year-old pretty much, is the Ranchi school founded by Paramahansa Yogananda in India, when he started with 15 boys, and he was teaching them to write, to read, and then they will have meditation sessions. And all those boys grew up to have a different perception to life, and the school grew from 15 to hundreds of boys, because the parents realized the potential and the changes in their children. And there are multiple schools like that in India, but you really have to be consistent, bring children to nature, teach them about nature, and have that balance, bring that balance in their life.
Yes. And when you do, they have a very different life trajectory than if they hadn't learned those skills. It also changes their gene expression. It changes their brain functioning. So they tend to function much better in terms of academic performance, coordination, physical coordination, much less disease, much less mental health challenge, much less physical health challenge if you start your life that way. So it is so worth doing with these children early in life.
Yes. And also we talk about genes, and we know we have dormant DNA strains. What will be your advice to activate them?
Well, I think in terms of our genes that are expressed and those that are not. And one of the really dramatic studies of this was done in 2020. And this new generation of super high resolution scanners had been developed. This is one of the very first studies done of them. And these scanners can detect the accumulation of Alzheimer's plaques in the brain. Now, before these scanners, we used to have to detect those post-mortem. Once people died, we dissect their brains, we would measure the amount of Alzheimer's plaques in their brain. But after the scanners were developed, we could see the level of plaque in their brain without dissection. We could just tell by a scan how much plaque they had. And Alzheimer's is a strongly genetic disease. There is a gene called the apogene, and people with apogene 4 have much higher levels of Alzheimer's, like over 90% risk for Alzheimer's. People of apogene 102 have almost zero risk for Alzheimer's, okay? If you get an apogene 4 from your mother and a second apogene 4 from your father, you're an apogene 4-4. And classically, you have a 92% chance of developing Alzheimer's. So strongly genetic disease. So when they did the study, they thought, oh, well, we'll find that the people with an apogene 4-4 are the ones with Alzheimer's plaques in their brains. Not at all. Independent of genes, independent of lifestyle, smoking, obesity, independent of everything, there was one factor that determined the buildup of Alzheimer's plaques in the brain, and that was negative thinking. If people were negative thinkers, they had buildup of these Alzheimer's plaques in their brain. So we have these genes. We have genes that, if they're expressed, are going to promote cancer and heart disease and Alzheimer's and cognitive decline and frailty and rapid aging. And if we're exuberant, if we're loving, if our lives are full of joy, we are shifting gene expression. And that turns on genes that, for example, suppress cancer. In one EFT study, 72 genes were turned on after an EFT session, a 1 hour EFT session. Genes that suppress throat cancer, that suppress breast cancer and prostate cancer, genes that suppress bowel cancer, genes that help our bodies deal with ultraviolet radiation from the sun, genes that help our learning centers in the brain have good insulation around neurons, genes that tune our metabolism. All these genes were 72 genes upregulated by 1 hour of expert clinical EFT. So what we're doing as we use EFT, as we meditate, and there are lots of other studies showing that similar effects happen with good, deep meditation. The other interesting set of studies is that our telomeres, which are our molecular markers of aging, they shorten about 1% a year throughout our lives. Eventually, our cells just die when they get too short. That process of telomere loss is dramatically attenuated by meditation. When we meditate, we age much, much slower. And again, long-term studies show, as I mentioned earlier, that pessimists die on average 10 years earlier than optimists. Optimists live a lot longer than pessimists. All of these thoughts, all of these feelings, eventually, the tiny little thoughts, hundreds a day, but if you learn to master your mind, regulate your emotions, eventually you are going to live a longer life than you otherwise would have, and you're going to express all of these positive genes. You'll silence the ones that are going to create problems, like, for example, those apogene 4/4s that create Alzheimer's.
Yes, I mean, these bodies are such intricate biological machines that we keep finding new things, while at the same time, certain people want us to enhance the body and the brain with technology. So we didn't know enough about the bodies, but they want to put more technology. They want to kind of enhance us. But I think we have enough enhancement in our own hands and brain, so we don't need the technology.
Yeah. Self-enhancement. And
Yes.
we can tinker around with matter, but why not work at the level of energy? There are all these energy things we can do to help ourselves. If you know you can reduce your chances of Alzheimer's with a positive attitude, go do that. It's free. It's just a matter of your thinking. So go do those things that are simple. I've had my fair share of illnesses and injuries and things like that. The first thing I turn to is, what are the natural remedies available? There are always natural remedies. Does that mean I'll never need a prescription drug or never need the doctor? Of course not. I have modern medicine, I have modern drugs, but I want to first do the things I can do internally to shift myself. And we looked at technology, at stuff outside of ourselves for solutions. And I always advocate the first place to look is, what can I change? What's in my power internally to shift? Now, that might mean I go get something external as well. Like, just personally, for example, I take supplements. I take supplements for various things. I believe those external things can help my body thrive. But I'm really focused on the internal things. We know that these simple things are changing gene expression, changing neurological firing patterns, changing brain anatomy, changing physical anatomy, all these benefits purely at the level of energy.
Yes. Dawson, any programs you have and you like to detail in this during this interview that people might go and check it out and use it?
Yeah, so if you go to my website you just go to dawsongift.com, my basic website. It'll give you access to the EFT mini manual. It'll give you access to a meditation that has been shown to raise your immunity. And so you want to at least download that manual, download that audio track at dawsongift.com, and then practice those things. So that's one entry point into what I offer. Book a session with a practitioner. We have an app called Stress Solution. You can download the app on the App Store or the Android store. Stress Solution. Just do one session. It's free. The first session is free. do a session with a live practitioner, and you will feel those changes inside your body. We have books, we have online courses. We make them really cheap as well. Like our anxiety course is $18 and our insomnia course is $29. And these are proven to result in dramatic drops in anxiety and in insomnia. So we have a PTSD course. We have a variety of classes. We have certification. If you'd like to change your career and become an energy healing professional, we do that. We train thousands of people every year in these techniques. So there's a lot there. There's a whole world out there. And use the things that are most relevant to you now. So if you have insomnia, use the insomnia course. If you have anxiety, the anxiety course. Learn meditation, commit to that daily practice. If you do one thing, just set your alarm 20 minutes earlier every day and meditate. That's the very, very, very first thing to do. You can tap then when you get stressed during the day, but those two techniques alone are going to start to change you, and they'll change you, research shows, within a month. And all of that's free at that DawsonGift.com website.
Thank you very much. And don't forget, when you do all this, you're going to put some doctors out of practice, out of job, which is good. You know, they have to change their careers as well, and use the EFT as well. Yes, Dawson, we are approaching the end of the interview. Any final thoughts?
You know, Claudiu, we are beings of infinite potential. And, you know, when I look at my grandkids when they're born, I try and be there for the birth of each grandchild. And, you see this little being full of potential. And you and I and everyone came into the world like that. And then we're 2 or 3, we're 4, then we're 5, we express that potential. And then things happen that suppress our potential. And our job as an adult is to release all of the things that have been suppressing our potential and become those glorious beings of love and light we came here to be. Research shows that when we look at people doing these practices, they don't just get like 10% happier, they get like 10 times happier. And so a happy life is within everybody's grasp, and it's just what you choose to do. And so I want to just inspire people with that reality. We know what science tells us. We have the tools at our disposal. Use them, and your life is infinitely richer and infinitely happier.
Dawson, thank you very much for everything you do to keep us happy and change our genes to higher potential. And all the best to your colleagues and friends and the practitioners you created over the years. And until next time, thank you very much for joining.
It's an absolute joy.
Thank you. And to my viewers, thank you for watching. Share it, like it, download a free copy of my book when you visit my website. Visit spiritualinspired.ca, a standalone website right now, and you can find us on Conscious Awakening Network. Until next time, love and gratitude.